Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Fast and the Furious, starring Vin Diesel, Paul Walker, Michelle Rodriguez, and Jordana Brewster, and directed by Rob Cohen. Now, before I get into this, I did see this first one in theaters, and I remember not really understanding a thing about it, except I liked the racing scenes, but overall I didn't understand it as a maybe minor, I'll say. But let's see if it's still the case. Let's get into this movie, as I'm looking forward to Fast and Furious 9. The plot of stealing TVs and DVD players is a little updated these days, which is the plot of not Johnny Tran, but Dominic Toretto, who robs a truck full of them with fast cars as we move on to LAPD officer Brian O'Connor, played by Paul Walker, testing his car. I do miss Paul Walker, though. May he rest in peace. And I'll talk more about that when I get to 7, but to see how fast his car can go. So he can join a race and goes to a cafe called Toretto's to have a tuna sandwich where it's ran by Dominic Toretto, played by Vin Diesel himself, with his sister Mia, played by Jordana Brewster. And arriving a few minutes later, Letty, played by Michelle Rodriguez, with Vince, Jesse, and Leon, arrive as Vince is the one who picks a fight with Brian, and Dom knocks it off, and Dom finds out his name is Brian Spillner, and Brian goes back to work for Harry as Dom wants Brian fired, and as that night becomes, they race for money with Brian getting involved. Now, am I dreaming, or is this the same plot as the 1990 movie of Point Break? Because this feels like a copy of that movie, as the race starts with Brian meeting Hector and Edwin as the Toretto family shows up for the race, and Brian joins in the race as they block off the road. As I do sort of like the characters, but this feels familiar. Where have I seen this before? Oh yeah, I saw that in the original Point Break about 5 years ago, even though not the remake, but the original. Rob Cohen, the director of this movie, plays a Pizza Hut driver getting blocked off the race cars, which was a funny cameo as the race starts. And I do like we see the engine on the inside, as Dom is the fastest driver there is on the street race of LA. Brian tries to catch up with Dom as he's quicker as Brian tries to be the fastest one, but his engine smokes and Dom gets in first place while Brian is in last place because his engine smoked him up. And Brian says to Dom, "I almost had you." And Dom said, "He never had me. He didn't even have his car," which was pretty funny, and goes on the monologue until the cops show up and they all try to run away from them and Dom almost escapes, but Brian saves his ass and Dom gets in Brian's car and Brian is able to get away from the cops. And this movie isn't as fun as I remembered, except for the car scenes. And I also remember not being able to follow this movie very well, like I brought up earlier, but at best it's mediocre. Johnny Tran's Men comes for both Dom and Brian when Johnny has his thugs shoot up Brian's car, and they walk home as he tells Brian about the disagreement between him and Tran, as he tells the story to Brian, as this didn't feel as exciting. They arrive at the Toretto house, and Dom brings Brian inside for a beer, as Dom grabs Vince's beer and gives it to Brian, and Vince is pissed about it and threatens Brian as Mia brings up Brian upstairs and takes Mia, which sort of a nice quiet moment of the film. The next day, Brian gets taken to the sergeant's hideout, and they talk about how close they are getting to Dom. And when did this movie turn into the remake of Point Break? I'm not talking about the 2015 one. I'm talking about the 1990 one, as that was before the 2015 movie, which I did see, unfortunately. But I like the original better. Let's move on. With the one cop working for the criminal, it's unoriginal. They fix up a car that Brian brings to Dom, as we learn a little more about the characters. For example, Jesse, as we learn, as he has ADD, which is a disability. Dom loves to have barbecues in the daytime, and I love when Leon calls Vince the coyotes are us. I was cracking up at that moment. It made me laugh. Coyotes are us. Oh, I'll never forget that. Brian sneaks and breaks into a warehouse where he could find something as he's encountered by Vince and Dom, and Vince suspects he's a cop, and by he I'm talking about Brian, as Vince has a thing for Mia, and he gets jealous after Brian asks her on a date, and they break into Tran's garage, and Brian learns he stole the TVs and DVD players, while the others are getting stuff for Hector, while Tran is torturing a guy named Ted by putting oil in his mouth as he tells Tran his parts are in the warehouse, and makes Ted kiss his shoes and kicks him in the face, which has got to be the most ridiculous villain in the series. Dom shows Brian the car his father drove before he died, as Dom is afraid of driving that car and says the line, "I live my life a quarter mile at a time," which is repeated in the trailers of the new movie as it's the second best line in the movie. There's 3 great lines in this movie. One is "Coyotes are us." I'll never forget that one. 2 is the one I just brought up, and the 3rd is "I almost had you," with the monologue by Vin Diesel. 3 greatest lines ever in this movie. Brian takes Mia to the place Vince wanted to take her on a date called Cha Cha Cha's, which is another nice quiet time as I'm having an okay time with this movie, and I love the face of Paul Walker when Mia drives. It looked hysterical. Brian goes undercover with the SWAT team to arrest Tran as he's being let go, as the captain pins this on Brian as Brian is pissed off, and Dom and Brian go for a drive to test the car that they invented, as they smoke a Ferrari, and they stop at a restaurant at a beach, and Brian wants in on Dom's family as he gets in race wars, which is in the middle of the desert, as we move on to that scene, and we get Letty getting flirted by a contender, and they race, and she wins the race, which was a funny scene. Brian bumps into Jesse and sees he's racing against Tran, and unfortunately, Tran wins the race, and Jesse runs away from Tran as Tran picks a fight with Dom, as Tran blames Dom for SWAT arresting Tran's ass as they go on a heist to get more TVs and DVD players, as we learn it was Dom, and Brian isn't really ready to bring Dom in and tells Mia he's a cop and wants to get Dom and the group from going on his truck heist, and the truck heist is where the movie is falling apart, as it's fine to okay, in not a great way, I'll say. Brian calls dispatch and reveals Dom he's a police officer, as they all take off, and Brian goes back to the house with the gun as he didn't bring backup, and Dom wants to find Jesse as he shows up as he's so scared and gets shot by Tran, and I feel bad for Jesse. Both Brian and Dom go after Tran as one splits up and Dom crashes into him, or one of them, I'll say, and drives on to the other guy, and the other guy is shot up, and Brian catches up with Dom and races him on as a train arrives, and they both make it, and Dom crashes into a truck, and Brian lets Dom take off, and the climax is fine at best, as it doesn't make it a great movie by any means. The after credits scene is whatever, in my opinion, but I like that line. Dom said that was the second best line. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 5.1 out of 10. I sort of like the characters as they're memorable, but not as memorable as when I get to part 5. The acting is bad, the plot is not great either, and the car stunts were rather tragic after seeing Paul Walker's death in real life. This isn't the greatest movie I've ever seen, but I did enjoy the 3 lines and the cars, as racing cars, I'll say, and the 3 lines I brought up during the show, as one was inspiring, and this series for the series, I'll say, as 2 of them were absolutely hilarious, but at the end of the day, it's an okay time, and that's why I'm giving this the mildest of recommendations. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with Too Fast, Too Furious. And until next time, let's race.